9 minutes and 29 seconds changed the world 2 years ago. George Floyd, an African-American man, was killed right here in Minneapolis by a white police officer who knelt on Floyd's neck and begged for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. The name George Floyd became a symbol for the fight for racial justice and against police brutality against black people. His killing emboldened the Black Lives Matter movement all around the world. The Washington Post reporter Robert Samuels is one of the two authors of the deeply reported book His Name is George Floyd, One Man's Life and the Struggle for Racial Justice. Robert, thank you so much for making time for Deutsche Welle today. Before we start talking about George Floyd's death and the implications and all the promises which were made afterwards, I would like to start talking about him as a person. So, who was George Floyd?
We spoke with a lot of friends and family of George Floyd, and they all talked about him in very similar ways. They talked about him being a very friendly person, someone who would always recognize if you were doing something different on the street, if you had new shoes or a new hairstyle. They talked about him being a jokester and having a good sense of humor. And they talked about how he always wanted to tell people he loved them. That was how he ended almost every conversation, because he had known that growing up in his neighborhood, people don't hear "I love you" a lot. So that's how he would end every conversation.
When did he really struggle with his life? Maybe you can talk a little bit about his early adult life.
One of the things we look at in the book is that when George Floyd was in second grade, he wanted to become a Supreme Court justice. That was his dream, because he had learned about Thurgood Marshall, the first black Supreme Court justice, and he wanted to be like him. He was also reading at grade level, which was really hard if you grew up in a community that didn't have a lot of resources. He was one of the few kids in his class who was reading at grade level on national benchmarks. But over the course of his life, as George Floyd grows up, he eventually becomes 6'6", 225 pounds. He's a big guy. People see him, and instead of encouraging him to study textbooks, they give him a football, they give him basketball, and they say to him, "You should become an athlete. You should go. This is how you're going to get a college scholarship. This is how you're going to go to become a professional sports player. This is how you're going to lift yourself out of poverty." And George Floyd believes that. That's the promise that's given to him. But the sad truth is, by the time he gets to college, he does not have the academic requirements to be able to succeed in college. So he never plays, and he's in these remedial classes while his mother gets sick. And the mother is also taking care of some of George Floyd's nieces and nephews, feeling that he needs to do more to help the family. He goes back to CUNY homes, but he can't find a job without a college degree, and he can't find a job in the neighborhood. So he does what a lot of people in the neighborhood do. He starts selling drugs. And because he's sad, and because he looks for an escape like so many of the people in the neighborhood, he also starts using them as a way to get his mind off things. And that leads to a cycle, both of a cycle of drug dependency and addiction, but also a cycle of going in and out of prison. Because during that time, the federal government was putting on the war on drugs. And then came the crime bill, in which they put lots of officers on the street and delivered harsh sentences to people who are doing drugs and using drugs. George Floyd, he gets caught in that system, and he ends up spending more than a third of his adult life in prison, mostly for offenses that were never violent, mostly for drug deals that are about $10 or $20. And even though he says, and we looked at the intake forms and all the records in the book, even though he says, "I need help, I have an addiction, I'm hearing voices," no one believes him. which is a common thing when you look at the science and the research in terms of how uh, doctors treat black people, particularly black men. Oftentimes, when they say they're in pain or they're struggling, they don't believe them.
Until the very end. They
Yeah.
didn't believe him until he was killed.
Yeah.
A white police officer who kneeled, I think all of our viewers are very aware of that, more than 9 minutes on his neck. And George Floyd was crying for help. He reached out to his mama and he wasn't believed. Nobody believed him. So, Robert, after he got killed, after this video went viral, there was a lot of solidarity. There were many protests all around the world. And there was a presidential campaign. And then candidate Joe Biden promised a lot. For example, a police reform. Nothing happened.
Well, Joe Biden, he creates a very tight bond with a lot of the family, particularly George Floyd's brothers, Philonis and Rodney. And we talk about their interactions in the book. And the day Derek Chauvin gets convicted, Joe Biden gives the family a call and he says, we're going to do this. We're going to pass this big piece of legislation to do police reform in George Floyd's name. And not only that, we're going to do it in the way you wanted to do it, to mark the 1-year anniversary of his murder. But things never go that easily in Washington. And even though there is a lot of solidarity in this country to end systemic racism and to do things to prevent something like the incident that happened between George Floyd and Derek Chauvin from ever happening again, it got bogged down in infighting, in bureaucracy, in the differences between how much responsibility a police officer should be able to withstand because they committed a crime, and the bill ultimately fails.
What does all that mean for the African American community, especially in Minneapolis? I mean, you and your colleague, you spend so much time down there.
Yeah. Well, so many people marched in the streets in Minneapolis and across the country and all over the world because they believed that after witnessing such a horrible murder, that this could be the chance. Maybe this is the time for the world to change. And that eventually confronted the sad reality about how things go in America, that when the concept of racism comes up, people feel blamed, they feel shamed, they don't want to talk about it in the fullest way. And so when you consider all of that, so many times the Black community, they are forced to accept what they get.
What does all that mean for a democracy, like which always comes down to voting? I mean, there was so much hope after Derek Chauvin was finally convicted.
It's really unclear. One of the interesting conversations that we had was with Reverend Al Sharpton, who had long tried to make police violence one of the central civil rights issues. And at first, people thought of it as a localized issue. And then he talks about how it took the backseat because there are more important things that are a higher priority, like the right to vote. Now in this country, we're seeing that history repeat itself. We're seeing discussions about voting rights reemerge, feeling that there are laws and there are legislation being put forward to make it harder for people of color to vote in this country. And again, they're fighting the same sort of battles that most people thought were settled 50 years ago. And so it's really unclear what happens now. If you look at what's happening in Georgia, where George Floyd's murder helped to inspire so many people to go out and vote and elect 2 Democratic senators, one of the first black senators still in this country post Reconstruction, as well as elect Joe Biden to office in a cradle of the South, you saw more restrictive voting rights. And over the primary, you saw more people saying, we're not going to take it. We're going to find ways to be able to vote. So again, it goes back to this very strange principle that we have in this country, which is you make you have laws that make it harder for black people to live their lives, and then you expect them to go through great lengths to be able to achieve some of the same fundamental rights and values that white people have. Unfortunately, that's the perennial story of this country.
What role will the growing cultural war play in all that? I mean, and also talking about this big replacement theory, which horrible outcome we just experienced in Buffalo, where an 18-year-old killed 10 African Americans.
I don't know. What we know is that there is a real fear in this country about what will happen when the plurality of people in this country are no longer white. And we saw the most extreme version of that playing out in Buffalo, but it plays out in small ways all across the country, right? And a part of that has to do with some of the things we talk about in the book. You know, I've grown up here all my life, love this country. And yet, there are so many instances when we looked at George Floyd's history and what was going around that I didn't know. And it makes me wonder if we had the full story, if we were taught from the very beginning that anyone can do anything, but sometimes there were laws that made it harder for certain people to do something, maybe we'd have a better shot at having a better tomorrow. So I think the question really comes down to how are we going to educate people? How are we going to inform them about the fact that what happened in the past still has impacts today? And how can we do it in a way that doesn't feel like people should be shamed or angry or guilty? I say it's one of the strangest things that the books that we were told everyone should read in 2020 are now the books that continue to be banned in 2022. What's that about? And I think we have to have real conversations in the country about why it's happening and be ready to acknowledge and confront some of the country's demons. That's what the book tries to do. But as a journalist, I believe that's a part of it. If we want a fairer and more democratic society, that's what we have to do.
So, Robert, you and your co-author Tolu, you're both two African American young men. How did working on this book change your lives?
When I started this project, I too thought of racism as just a dark cloud and that was just static and hung over us. But as I spent time with the Floyd family and people who loved them, as I met more mothers who looked like my mom, who had lost sons who looked like me to police violence over dubious practices, you start to see something. And you start to see that racism moves in a way. It doesn't just stay in a place. It moves and it breathes within people. And if you don't do something to acknowledge and confront it, it will corrupt your spirit. It will threaten you. It could kill you. And so this became so much more of a reminder of why journalism is important, because we make a bet with the reader that if we present you information in a way that's accurate and delicate, it might unlock something in you in the way that you might view the world. And so that's what we tried to do. It became more of a mission. It deepened my mission for journalism. And I became acutely aware that if more people didn't understand, it could be my life that's next. And I think about it, somebody asked me the other day what I think the difference between me and George Floyd was. And it's not that I had a father, even though I did have a father in my life. That's helpful, but it's not the reason I'm alive. It's not that I had a great education. I did have a great education, but I also went to Title I schools, just like George Floyd. The reason I'm alive today and George Floyd is not is because I didn't see Derek Chauvin on May 25th, 2020. And that's a horrifying thing to be able to recognize.
Are you more or less hopeful after finishing this book?
I'm more. I really am. Because when you see the persistence of the Floyd family over the years, George Floyd had every reason not to try, any reason not to believe in the American system and the promise of it. But he did until the day he died. And how do we know that? We know that because he responded to the officer in the way he was always told to respond to officers, by saying please and thank you and sir and respecting them, even when they were killing him. And after that, you saw so many people take up that cause because they knew it wasn't right. And what that showed to me is that there's still some hope of light. There's still some light there that is maybe untapped. You have to consider that people were moved to march after they saw George Floyd die. You have to consider the places that I used to protest because of discrimination and bad laws are now places that have black mayors and black police chiefs. There was a time where two black men who look like you, who are your age, would never get the support from a publisher to write what you had written. And so I think there's a lot to be hopeful for.
Robert Samuels, thank you so much, not only for this interview, but also for writing this book. It's so deeply reported. I learned so much when I was reading it, and it's a good read as well. It will be translated into German as well, and I hope it gets many, many readers all around the world. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.